In 1480, in the German city of Bamberg, a peasant paid half a pfennig to sweat inside a public bathhouse. Not once a year. Not on some special holiday. That was the going rate. And the records show peasants paying it regularly. So, if you've pictured medieval peasants as crusty, unwashed and terrified of water, you've been lied to. They had no soap bars sitting on a shelf, no tap you could turn. Getting clean took work, planning and fire. But that's exactly why the way they did it is so much more interesting than they just didn't bother. Here's what actually happened, starting with the moment most people get wrong. Picture a peasant household before dawn. No plumbing, no faucet, nothing you'd recognize as a bathroom. What they had was a basin, a jug, and a well or a stream within walking distance. Someone in the house, usually a woman or a child, made the walk. A full bucket of water weighs around 20 pounds, and most households needed several trips a day just for cooking, drinking, and washing. That water didn't get wasted. Hands and face first, always, because eating with your hands was the norm, and nobody wanted to eat with dirty ones. Historians who've gone through medieval etiquette manuals keep finding the same instruction repeated: wash before you sit down to eat, and wash again after. This wasn't a suggestion, it was manners, drilled into people the same way we drill in, don't talk with your mouth full. So already the idea that peasants never washed falls apart. But bathing, a full body soak in a tub, was a different story. And that's where the myth actually comes from. Heating enough water to fill a wooden tub meant burning fuel for hours. Wood or peat cost money, and for a family scraping by on farm labour, that cost mattered. Then you had to haul the hot water, sometimes 20 gallons of it, from the fire to the tub, and emptied it again when you were done. For most peasant households, that was a once-a-week project, not a daily one. When it happened, the whole family often used the same water, one after another, hence the old warning about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That phrase is literally about reusing bathwater until the last person in line was the baby. But here's the detail that surprises people every time. Even without a bar of soap in the house, peasants weren't scrubbing with plain water. They were making their own cleaning agent. And it worked. Take wood ash, the leftover from every cooking fire, and run water through it. What drips out is lye, an alkaline liquid strong enough to cut through grease and dirt. Mix that lye with animal fat, usually tallow saved from butchering, boil it down, and you get a crude soap. Peasant households across medieval Europe did exactly this. It wasn't rare or advanced knowledge, it was a normal household task, the same way baking bread or salting meat was. Laundry worked the same way, just at a bigger scale. Instead of a washing machine, households used a method called bucking. Dirty linen went into a large tub, ash was layered on top, and hot water was poured through the whole pile, again and again, letting the alkaline liquid strip out stains and grease as it filtered down. It was slow. It took an entire day, sometimes stretched into 2. But it worked well enough that the technique survived for centuries, showing up in household manuals as late as the 1800s, long after factory soap existed. So peasants weren't choosing between clean and dirty. They were choosing between store-bought soap, which cost money, and homemade soap, which cost time and fuel. Most chose the second option because time was the one thing a peasant family actually had. Hair got the same treatment. Without shampoo, people washed it with a mix of ash-based lye and water, or sometimes lime and salt, worked into a paste. One surviving household guide even recommends washing hair with the ashes of burnt vine cuttings mixed with barley chaff, a recipe that was supposed to leave it looking golden. Whether it actually worked is another question. But the point stands. Hair care wasn't skipped. It just used whatever was on hand instead of a bottle from a shelf. Teeth got attention too, and this is the detail people find hardest to believe. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, and yet medieval sources describe people scrubbing their teeth with hazel twigs chewed soft at one end until the fibres frayed into something close to bristles. Others used a rough linen cloth wrapped around a finger, rubbed along the teeth after meals. Herbal powders made from mint, salt, or ground cloves worked as an early toothpaste substitute, and a splash of wine or vinegar mixed with herbs served as mouthwash. One medieval writer travelling through Wales was so struck by how clean the locals kept their teeth that he wrote they shone like ivory. That's not a compliment you pay to a population everyone assumes was rotting in the mouth. Bad breath mattered socially too. People carried small cloths or bundles of herbs specifically to freshen their mouths before talking to someone up close, because in a world without dentists on every corner, a foul mouth was something you tried to manage yourself, not something you just lived with. Now, if you lived in a town instead of the countryside, you had another option entirely: public bathhouses. These weren't rare luxury spots. Medieval towns across Europe had them, and they were genuinely popular. Bathhouse owners in cities like Bamberg charged by the type of bath, a cheap steam session or a pricier full tub soak, and the fee for the basic option was affordable to almost everyone except the truly destitute. Some bathhouses even offered free days for the poor, funded by wealthy patrons or the church, because clean citizens were seen as a public good. Walk into one of these places and you'd find something closer to a social club than a chore. People gossiped, played games, ate, drank, all while soaking. It was where you caught up on town news, not just where you got clean. For a lot of people, Bathhouse Day was the highlight of the week. That should already be reshaping how you picture this. But here's where it gets darker, because bathhouses didn't stay popular forever, and the reason why explains a lot about how the filthy peasant myth got started in the first place. As the Middle Ages wore on, disease outbreaks, including waves of plague, made shared bathwater and crowded steam rooms look increasingly dangerous. Bathhouses also earned a reputation, fair or not, for doubling as brothels, since mixed nude bathing gave them a reputation the church didn't love. City after city started shutting them down or regulating them into irrelevance. By the 1500s and 1600s, public bathing had collapsed across much of Europe, and a strange belief took its place that water itself opened your pores and let disease in. Doctors of the period genuinely advised patients to avoid bathing to protect their health. That's not a medieval belief, that's a Renaissance and early modern one. The dirty medieval peasant people picture is actually describing the centuries after the Middle Ages, when bathing dropped off, not during it. And the irony doesn't stop there. Centuries after peasants were making their own soap for free, the English government decided to tax the stuff. Starting in the early 1700s, soap became one of the most heavily taxed household goods in England, and soap makers were legally required to keep their boiling vats locked overnight so the government could control production and collect its cut. That tax stuck around for well over 100 years before it was finally repealed in the mid-1800s. So the era people think of as more hygienic than the dirty medieval period is the exact same era that made clean living more expensive on purpose. Laundry followed its own separate battle. Streams, wells and riverbanks doubled as open-air laundries for entire villages, which sometimes caused actual conflict. One English town in the 1400s banned laundry at its public water source entirely, because the soap and dirt running off into the water were driving away the fish people relied on for food. Clean clothes and a stocked fishing hole were, apparently, mutually exclusive. So how did the myth get pinned on medieval peasants specifically, when the real neglect of hygiene happened later? Blame the writers who came after. Enlightenment thinkers and Victorian historians had every incentive to paint the medieval period as backward, dirty and superstitious because it made their own era look enlightened by comparison. They leaned hard into the Dark Ages framing, and unwashed peasants fit the story they wanted to tell. Paintings and manuscripts from the actual medieval period, showing people bathing, visiting bathhouses and washing daily, got quietly ignored in favour of the version that made for a better before and after story. You've probably seen that version in movies. Mud-caked extras with blackened teeth, stumbling around a filthy village. It's a great visual, it's just not accurate. Costume designers reach for it because contrast reads well on screen. Grime against candlelight, rot against silk. But if you dropped a real medieval peasant into a modern room, freshly washed, hair combed with herb-scented lye, teeth scrubbed pale with hazel and mint, they'd look far closer to a normal person having a rough week than the swamp creature Hollywood keeps casting. Even the language we use gives it away. We still say something is filthy as a pig, not filthy as a medieval peasant. because contemporaries of the period weren't the ones spreading this idea about themselves. It was invented well after the fact by people who never had to haul the water or tend the fire themselves. What actually happened is a story of constraint, not ignorance. Peasants understood cleanliness mattered. They understood disease, or at least believed dirt and disease were connected, centuries before germ theory proved them right for the wrong reasons. What they lacked wasn't the will to be clean, it was infrastructure. No pipes, no taps, no purchased soap sitting in every kitchen. Everything had to be earned through labour, water hauled by hand, fuel chopped and burned, lye and fat boiled down over hours. That's the real story worth sitting with for a second. Every basin of clean water in a peasant home represented someone's morning walk to the well. Every bar of homemade soap represented saved fat from a butchered animal and hours tending a fire. Cleanliness wasn't free. It was earned, trip by trip, batch by batch. If you're the kind of person who likes finding out the version of history you were taught in school, skipped a few chapters, this channel does exactly that every week. Worth a subscribe if you want more of it. The system peasants built without soap bars or running water wasn't primitive, it was resourceful. Ash and fat became a working detergent. A well became a plumbing system, one bucket at a time. A public bathhouse became both a shower and a social hub, until fear of disease and religious pressure shut the whole network down. Every piece of it solved a real problem with whatever materials were on hand, and most of it worked well enough to survive for hundreds of years. There's also a class layer worth noting because peasant covered a wide range of people. A tenant farmer scraping by on rented land and a free craftsman running his own shop both got lumped into that word, and their hygiene routines looked different. The craftsman with steady income might visit the bathhouse weekly and own a bar of purchased soap. The subsistence farmer relied almost entirely on the basin, the ash and whatever fat was left over from the last slaughter. Even within peasant life, clean was a spectrum, same as it is today. Compare that to a lord in his manor, and the gap widens even further. Nobility had servants dedicated purely to hauling and heating bathwater, which meant a wealthy person could top and tail. A quick wash of the hands, face and feet twice a day or more without lifting a finger themselves. Their soap was often imported Castile soap made from olive oil instead of tallow, which smelled better and lathered smoother. Some lords travelled with their own portable tub, rather than risk relying on whatever a roadside inn could offer, because showing up unwashed to another noble's hall was a genuine social risk. Knights preparing for their knighting ceremony were expected to take a ceremonial bath beforehand, a tradition formal enough that it shows up repeatedly in period writing. None of that was available to the family working someone else's field. What separated a peasant's hygiene from a lord's wasn't the desire to be clean. It was who did the hauling, who paid for the fuel, and who got to skip the labour entirely. Soldiers and travellers had their own workaround, since neither a home basin nor a town bathhouse was always within reach. Portable tubs sometimes came along on campaign, and armies developed their own rough hygiene routines around river crossings and camp life, because an unwashed army was a sick army just as much as an unwashed household was. Even on the move, the basic instinct held. Find water, find fire if you can spare it, and do what you can with what's around you. And that etiquette piece matters more than people give it credit for. In a world without forks for most of the population, hands did the eating, which meant hands had to be clean, or at least clean enough not to offend the people sitting next to you. Wedding feasts, harvest celebrations, church gatherings, all of them came with an unspoken expectation that you'd shown up washed. Showing up dirty wasn't just unpleasant, it was read as disrespect. Actual dining guides from the period spell this out line by line. Keep your fingernails trimmed. Don't put a bitten piece of food back on the shared plate. Don't touch your nose or ears at the table. These weren't throwaway suggestions written for nobles alone. Versions of this etiquette filtered down through households at every level, because a shared meal with your hands meant everyone's hygiene was, quite literally, on the table. Bedding created its own hygiene battle most people never think about. Straw mattresses were cheap and universal, but straw also made a perfect home for fleas and lice. Families fought back by mixing dried herbs and flowers into the straw itself, things like lavender, mint, and chamomile, which acted as a crude but genuinely effective form of pest control. It's the same instinct behind a modern cedar closet, or a sachet in a drawer just built from whatever was growing nearby. Clothing had its own rotation system too. Most households kept at least 2 sets of everyday clothing specifically, so one set could be washed while the other was worn, which meant laundry day didn't leave anyone standing around with nothing to wear. It sounds obvious now, but it required planning, spare fabric, and time nobody had much of to spare. So next time you picture a medieval village, picture the smoke rising from a fire heating bathwater on a Saturday. Picture a woman working ash and tallow into soap on the kitchen table. Picture a bathhouse full of laughing townsfolk trading gossip over a steam bath. None of that fits the movie version. All of it is closer to what actually happened. The myth stuck around because it made a better story than the truth. The truth is slower, more resourceful, and honestly more impressive. People with almost nothing figured out how to stay clean using fire, ash, animal fat, and a well. No soap aisle, no plumbing, just knowledge passed down and repeated every single week for centuries, until the world finally caught up and started selling the shortcut in a bar. There's a whole list of everyday medieval habits like this waiting on screen if you want the next one.